Thank you very much, Stephanie and Eric. And now we have the VC panel, which I think should be of great interest to all the entrepreneurs here in the audience. And that's going to be led by Pradip Shankar of Ericsson and three very distinguished VCs from Silicon Valley. So let's see what Pradip and the VCs have to talk about the cloud infrastructure.
Storage pricing cut in half and compute pricing cut by more than a third. Amazon announced its 42nd price cut in 8 years 6 weeks ago. The transition to cloud, if anybody has any doubts about it, is happening. It's happening really fast. And to tell us what lies ahead, we have an exciting panel for you. As Vishal mentioned, my name is Pradip Shankar. I'm with Ericsson. I'm part of the corporate ventures team at Ericsson. I'm based here in Silicon Valley. We have Rick Bolander, co-founder of Gabriel Venture Partners. He was had a long experience funding and building infrastructure and software companies. We have Arif Janmohamed of Lightspeed Venture Partners, who's focused on data center and cloud. And we have ASHEEM CHANDNA of Greylock, who's been on the Midas list for the last 3 years. So what we're going to do today is to maximize the time available, 30 minutes, to sort of go over the various areas of cloud and invite our panelists to comment on these areas and what their views on it from an investability standpoint. And then we will have each of them comment on the sort of the investment climate overall, as well as advice for potential entrepreneurs. You've all lasted the whole day, so you clearly are very motivated, which is a very, very good sign. There is actually libations after this, so I think there is incentive as well, beyond what these guys have to say. So I want to start with actually the SaaS area, because it's very easy to understand the lower costs, lower operational headaches, and so on. Has everything that can be SaaS and cloudified already done? Or there have been some exits and IPOs in this space? Are you still seeing new startups in the space? Are you seeing opportunities? So let's start with SaaS. Any one of you, and who would like to step up?
Sure, I'll step up. The last 5 or 6 years have been really exciting for SaaS. We've seen a flurry of massive acquisitions, multi-billion acquisitions like SuccessFactors, Taleo right now, a number of IPOs like Workday, et cetera. And some would say that this is the end of it. I would say this is the front end of a continued revolution around SaaS. We continue to see a ton of innovation around verticalized SaaS applications as well as mission-critical SaaS applications. Well, what do I mean by that? Well, I would argue that sort of the first 10 years of SaaS was the movement of non-necessarily mission-critical applications for the enterprise into the cloud, with the exception perhaps of Workday. We're seeing more and more companies that are now trying to attack the core of the enterprise, the heart of the enterprise, supply chain management, ERP, basically places that are the crown jewels. And some of these companies, for example, are Elementum, which was a spin out of Flextronics, Canandi, which is doing ERP. Also, what's interesting is verticalized SaaS. Viva has just really, I would argue, catalyzed people's imagination around what can be done in specific verticals. Viva went after the pharmaceutical industry and created a multi-billion-dollar industry specifically around CRM just for pharma. We're going to see more and more of that, whether it's real estate, whether it's construction, whether it's other industries that manufacturing that haven't necessarily been touched by the SaaS revolution.
I think just to add on that, 2 things real quickly. I think what you're going to start to see more is platform as a service, and not just the specific niche application areas, because I think more and more, not just the economies, but the agility provided by having platform as a service and layering on top applications, especially those that are very compatible with mobile devices, will become much more prevalent. The other thing I think to note is that there's still a lot of legacy systems out there, okay? And so a lot of these legacy systems aren't going to just overnight be replaced by a new application, such as a software as a service. However, with cloud computing and with standardization with mobile devices, whether it be using HTML5 or other type of standards, you can access these legacy systems, and there are solutions coming out that allows you to integrate the workflow between these legacy systems that you can't even do if you're inside the brick and mortar building, that allows you to kind of leverage cloud computing, and it's kind of, to the end user at least, feeling like software almost as a service, but it's not the pricing model as such.
And I can just briefly add and say, probably two new themes that you're going to see play out are, one is what I think Arif touched on, which is, vertical, and some people call industry clouds. So I think just like what Viva did in the pharma space, you're going to see that across a variety of industries. And then the second piece is just, I would say, big data and analytics. So that's the area that's really ripe, in terms of seeing new SaaS applications around that. And so whether that's log management and analytics, or whether that's we're involved with a company called Sumo Logic that does that, or whether it's business intelligence delivered in a SaaS form factor. And one example there would be we've been involved with a company called Domo, for example, that does that. So, but I think that's both those are pretty broad areas, and you're going to see more plays in those areas.
Yeah, in fact, it would seem that if you look at typical on-prem applications, the SaaS applications have an advantage in terms of being able to aggregate the data between multiple tenants and multiple consumers. So that's an area where they can really distinguish themselves over and above their enterprise on-prem counterparts. Are you seeing that beyond the verticalization, but the fact that they take advantage of multiple tenants? Are you seeing that in the newer offerings? Is that something you're seeing, or?
Yeah, I can just add. I think in particular, if you take like big data and analytics, right? One of the advantages these platforms have when you do them in a SaaS or on the cloud is, these systems see data across lots of data sources. They clearly keep every customer's data private, but just an inherent advantage they have is, you can work off very large numbers of data sets, and which is hard to do with a premise-based architecture. So.
Okay. You want to add to it?
No,
Okay.
I think that's a great point.
So even though the track was cloud infrastructure, I really wanted to cover, there's no place else that we're talking about cloud, so I really wanted to cover the SaaS area as well. Let's now talk about infrastructure as a service. In some ways, it's one of the early offerings that were out there. It's become a big player game with the traditional players, the web players, and the telcos all jumping in. OpenStack has started to emerge and is getting some level of traction, and all of the infrastructure as a service players are actually offering more and more services, back-end as a service, platform as a service. They're so merging in some ways. But let's ignore that for a second. Let's start with the basics of infrastructure as a service. Are you seeing anything in terms of hardware? The rack scale architectures are coming up. Is it a big boy game, or is it something that startups can innovate and so on? Are you seeing anything in terms of hardware? Let's just talk about hardware for a few minutes.
Obviously the needs when you go to this, as ASHEEM has already pointed out, the ability and it's not just an economies of scale game, it's a power of computing and resource allocation in a very agile way to be able to tap into analysis of very big, large data sets with a different type of computing power. So I think in terms of the network architecture, you're going to see a change, just like you saw from kind of the old days of timeshare coming full circle back to cloud computing. You're going to see an emphasis on what kind of power or agility and resource allocation between storage, service, and computing power. And then I think the large question is, once you have these type of architectures that are high performance for those high demand needs in place, how do you manage it? Kind of the next generation of SDN, software-defined networks, and how do you go about allocating these type of resources in a very user-based way?
Yeah, I think what's exciting right now is the unboxing of the enterprise and how startups are really looking at what the hyperscale companies like Google and Facebook did inside their companies to, one, reduce costs, and then two, take advantage of Moore's law and commodity hardware. And so companies, there's a number of companies that are essentially looking at the box appliance model, companies like F5 or Checkpoint or Cisco or Juniper, and saying, look, you no longer have to tightly couple the hardware with the software. And in fact, a lot of the primitives that used to need hardware acceleration can now actually be done in software. And in fact, with virtualization and scale-out infrastructure, that software can be distributed across a number of machines. And so I think this is what you were referring to in terms of SDN, but that's happening in storage also. People are talking about software-defined storage, where what used to be in the controller can now be distributed in software across a data center. This is a pretty exciting trend because, one, it enables people to put what used to be appliance-heavy CapEx boxes in software and scale up and scale down as they need.
Yeah, and I guess I could just add and say that, going back to your original question, Pradeep, and just in terms of hardware, I think it's tough to be a hardware systems entrepreneur nowadays. The world has changed,
right,
and it's changing rapidly. And you can rent compute and storage, by the minute or by the hour, at prices that are plummeting. At very, so just. I don't think any of us here would want to be a server product manager today.
Right.
So yeah, I think, that said, I'm sure there'll be some new systems companies in some of these areas, but I think there's a lot more interest, just as Rick and Arif were saying, just in terms of taking infrastructure and, decoupling the software layers from the hardware.
But that's not to say that the appliance model is completely dead. In fact, in the mid-market, it seems like where companies still want data centers but don't necessarily want to invest in expensive operators, people, an appliance model can still hold. So there's a company called Nutanix, which is essentially converged hardware and software, virtualization and storage in a box that scales out a la Google infrastructure. This is sold as an appliance into the mid-market, and it really facilitates the building of sort of private clouds. Nimble Storage, which just went public in December, also sells a mid-market appliance. That is storage that fits into a flash-optimized box and is sold through the channel. So if you're a systems engineer or systems entrepreneur, there still is some hope for you, and there's still innovation out there in certain pockets.
Yeah, I think it was important, as we discussed prior, important to point out where there's opportunity and where there isn't, so that we provide the right guidance to the aspiring entrepreneurs. So let's talk about networking a little bit more. We've talked about compute in some ways. Let's talk about networking. We heard the previous talk that Eric did. Clearly, you cannot have mobility and cloud without a robust network in between. And so, in some ways, it's been lost, and so the notion of a distributed cloud and the ability to actually fully utilize the capabilities of your mobile consumption device and match it to the delivery capabilities of your cloud is enabled by a network. So have you seen opportunities in the space? Do you believe it's important? Do you believe it's a startup game?
So on the networking side, I would say, there are certainly opportunities. There's been a lot of hype around SDN. There's a number of companies that have got funded that will not make it, unfortunately, right? That said, I would say, probably the most interesting thing that's going on near term in the next few weeks is, I think Arista is getting ready to go public, and that's clearly a real company. They've done an amazing job in terms of building out a product set for the data center in terms of switching, and that company probably over the next several years will become a multi-billion-dollar revenue company. So that's probably Cisco's most significant new threat. That's not a pure SDN company, even though they do market themselves as cloud-based networking, right? I think on the software side, actually Lightspeed and Greylock are involved with a company called Avi Networks, which is in semi-stealth, which is basically going after software-defined networking for the data center, so taking functions that have been done on standalone boxes in the data center and decoupling them from the hardware, if you will, so you can put them directly on servers. So that's one example of something new that we're involved with and have put our money behind our interest area. There's a bunch of companies out there doing what people call network function virtualization. For those of you that kind of track that area, I think the jury's still out about whether there's a real business there, in my humble opinion. Another company that I think that is worth watching is a company called Cumulus Networks, which none of us are involved with here, I think, on the panel. But the whole concept of white box switching, still very, very early. But a number of people are watching that carefully. Maybe I'll stop there and just.
Yeah, I would build on that. I think when we started looking at what today is called SDN market, probably in 2008, 2009, with the thesis that you can actually replace hardware functions with software. We essentially broke it up into the stack, right? You had L2, L3, layer 2, layer 3, which is routing and switching, and that led to our investment in Nicira. We then looked at the higher layers of the stack, which is L4 through L7, and we essentially looked at all of the companies that have created conga line boxes over the last 20 years. It's security functions, it's load balancing functions, it's DNS functionality. All of that, I think, is up for grabs. Another company that we invested in was Pertino, which is essentially using software-defined networking techniques, i.e. the separation of control and data plane, to attack the traditional WAN, the wide area network, really creating software-defined connections using a cloud and using software only. So how do you essentially use the cloud as a switch and create secure networks, what used to be called VPNs, all in software? So the point here is that all the boxes that have been created over the last 15, 20 years, I think, are fair game right now.
Thanks. I think we already covered storage. It is an area for disruption. The new startups, the Nutanix of the world, really can take on the big boys, and so that we already covered that. Let's move to platform as a service. I mean, it is a confusing area in some sense. There's something for everybody. There's open source activities like Cloud Foundry. There's clearly a need for easier application development, deployment, management of the infrastructure necessary for it. At the same time, there is concerns about performance and loss of control and so on when you look at PaaS. How do you think this is evolving? Are you looking for companies that come to you with new PaaS ideas? What's the advice that you give? ASHEEM, you want to start?
Sure. I would start off by saying I think it's a tough space for startups, just because economies of scale favor large players, and when you're competing with company, if you're competing with Amazon or Google or Microsoft, or IBM or others, it's just a very tough area.
Okay.
I would add to that in the sense that when you're building a platform, inevitably your customer might be a developer. And in many cases, developers don't have a lot of money to pay. So historically, we haven't necessarily seen a breakout company as a startup that is focused exclusively on PaaS.
Right. I think that at the end of the day, it's, as ASHEEM's kind of referring to, it's how do you play off of that? How do you get the operating leverage from that you can be successful with as a startup?
Okay. Let's now maybe talk about, I know there was a wave of investment some time ago. The reason I bring this up, I know that there will not be much interest today, but I still bring it up because, again, in the sense of providing advice. We spent the entire afternoon actually talking about management and orchestration, okay, cloud management and orchestration. And in some ways, it's history, but is it history? I want you to communicate that to the audience from your perspective.
Yeah, I can start on that. And I would actually say cloud management and orchestration, just broadly speaking, is a fertile area, and I think you will see new companies being built. I mean, just even if you take the last several weeks, there's multiple new companies getting started that are being funded on Sandal Road. So just because I think essentially you're taking capex out of the system, but complexity is going up, and that the way to address that complexity in OpEx is with better management systems and better management tools. Historically, most companies in those spaces get acquired and less go public. So that is something, but I think for an entrepreneur who starts with a good team, you can grow significant businesses. One example of a company, we're privileged to be in, and again, also with Lightspeed, is a company called App Dynamics. It's actually an entrepreneur of Indian origin, Jyoti Bansal. He's 35 years old, started when he was 29, 5 years ago, and today he has a company with 450 employees, over 1,000 customers, growing extremely rapidly, competing against Computer Associates and, HP and IBM, as a next generation management company. And I think this company, don't want to jinx it, but basically, could be the next billion-dollar software company. So just as, as one example right in the Bay Area.
So, but I was thinking more the right scale kinds of companies. Are you still investing in those kinds of companies?
Yes, I think RightScale in particular, is a little bit more tricky because they sit very close to Amazon, right? And they've gone multi-platform, but they're still, so it's a little bit of, there's value there, but the platform's also coming upstream or up the stack. So it's a question of, can you ride that?
Yeah, I think the problem that the first generation of companies that faced, and this would be Rightscale, this could be Cloud.com, this could be Eucalyptus, for example, was they were just squeezed. They were sort of they were middleware, but the value of that middleware just eroded over time as the infrastructure guys came up and the platform guys actually came down, and these guys were squeezed in terms of the actual value that they were presenting to their customers. But ASHEEM nailed it, as in terms of there's more complexity today. Things are just getting harder and harder for teams of people to manage, and so that's an opportunity for great computer scientists to actually go and solve. And so it might not be management in the traditional sense, but it just, I think, as the cloud gets more complex and as it becomes more mission critical, there's still fertile opportunity to innovate over here.
That's great, because we spent quite a lot of time this afternoon talking about it, and so good to hear that. Gabriel and Rick.
Just the only thing I'd add, because enough has been said, really, is that the basically cloud integration, the ability to go and bring various private, public clouds together, is going to be, I think, very important in terms of how you allocate these applications and issues around that. One thing we haven't touched on is identity management, and I think one thing that's preventing, I think, some of the adoption of cloud from moving as quickly as it could is a sense of security. What can I put on? What should I not put on? And a lot of times it's based on what they consider to be mission critical, secure applications versus not. And to the extent you can provide security around identity management, I think more and more willingness will be to use it. As an example, people are using mobile devices left and right coming to the workplace, and that was a cultural shift by saying everything had to be locked down. Likewise, to the extent that people have the perception that they will be secure, I think you'll see a faster growth in these applications being from the cloud to mobile devices.
Okay. Maybe that's a good segue into security. So that's a huge, it seems to me that there has been a lot of investment in that space. At the same time, there's still the concern. It may not be the top concern today, but it still seems to be a major concern when you think about cloud migrating to the cloud. So,
well, it's an inhibitor to growth.
Yes, yes. And so you're still looking for startups. It seems to me this is a place where startups can actually make a mark for themselves and then have a decent exit. Thoughts?
Yeah, this is. I think security is the gift that keeps on giving, and as workloads shift from behind the data center, where multiple startups really thrived and became established companies, and as those workloads move into the cloud, whether those workloads are sitting in Amazon or whether they're sitting in someone else's application SaaS, there's a ton of innovation that is happening today, and there's a ton of innovation that will continue to have to be done. And so a few examples of this are, if your data is sitting on Amazon, how do you encrypt the data at rest? How do you encrypt the data and secure the data in motion? Another example is, as your workloads move into SaaS applications, how do you secure and monitor your users' use of those SaaS applications? Lightspeed's invested in a company called Netscope. ASHEEM is invested in a company called SkyHigh. These are two companies that are really going after the problem that CISOs and CIOs are facing today, which is, hey, my mobile users are accessing things like Box and Dropbox today, and I'm completely blind, because that traffic is no longer going through my traditional boxes from Juniper or Palo Alto Networks or FireEye. That's one level of innovation that is happening today. But even more so as compute moves to mobile devices as opposed to laptops and desktops, the mobile device will become a point of attack. So that'll be a point of entry for bad guys into the enterprise, and that'll create opportunity for security startups to actually thrive.
Anything on security you want to add to that, ASHEEM?
Yeah, I can just add and say, I think just the whole area of cloud security is just ripe, right? And just to comment on the companies that Arif touched on. So Arif's involved in Netscope. I'm involved with a company called SkyHigh Networks. Started 2 years ago with three folks out of Cisco. Today, over 120 employees. I mean, growing at an amazing rate. Just because the topic of cloud security is just so topical, so extreme, like a hockey stick early curve in terms of customer acquisition. And if there are any bright engineers here in the room, you should look up the websites of these two companies, because they're great places to go work. Yeah.
Okay. We have a few minutes left. I do want to cover data services in general, because to me it seems a real great opportunity to have for developers to mix and match data services that meet a certain need in the cloud. It's a very, very good area it screams really opportunity to me. Comments on that? Different kinds of time series databases, various kinds of databases, data stores in general, data services in general. Do you see that as opportunities in the cloud context?
You mean cloud-based data services?
Yeah.
So clearly Amazon has a lot of infrastructure in
Correct.
place, right? And so does IBM. And so it's, I think, and some of those services are extremely fast-growing services on those platforms. I mean, there's a number of third-party companies, basically doing cloud-based data services. There's a lot of innovation going on, and basically just in terms of on-prem, NoSQL,
Right, sure.
and also clearly, with Hadoop, right?
Right.
So I think, hey, at some level, I mean, Oracle's entire market cap and their entire customer base over, let's say, the next decade is up for grabs. If you want to oversimplify this, so that's one way to think about it. It's not as simple as that because, I mean, it's not all going to go, but some pieces of this are going to move. I mean, if you just look at companies like, look at the growth of Cloudera, for example, or other companies, in that category, or look at, MongoDB,
Right.
And what's going on, there. So.
Yeah, I would absolutely agree. I think for the largest of the large enterprises who will absolutely not move anything to the cloud, they will continue to use Oracle. But for the mid-market and a number of startups that are building their entire businesses on the cloud, there's a huge opportunity to serve those people in terms of either transactional type databases or analytical processing databases. And one of the bets that we made a few years ago was in a company called Qball, and this is the team that came out of Facebook and built the big data platform inside Facebook. And so what they're essentially doing is they've taken all their learnings out of Facebook and they're applying it to the cloud. And so they will go to the customers that don't want to build an on-premise Hadoop cluster, don't want to manage that cluster, and they will say, why don't you put all of your data up in the cloud, and we'll give you a SQL interface into that to do ad hoc reporting, or you can build your applications on top of us. Right? This is an example of something that didn't exist a few years ago because there weren't necessarily a lot of companies on the cloud.
Thanks. So in 1 minute or less, could each of you now talk about, general advice to the entrepreneurs in terms of, is this a good time to get into the business and so on? And what's the investment climate like? So maybe start with Arif.
Sure. Be bold, think big, assemble a fantastic team. Notwithstanding the public markets and some of the correction that's happened in tech stocks over the last couple of months, this is still an amazing time to be building a company in the cloud. We're sitting at the front of 4 massive tectonic shifts in the enterprise and the data center, and this is a great time to capitalize. By that I mean mobile, cloud, big data, and SaaS. And so there are ripe opportunities across all of these as you look at the traditional enterprise infrastructure stack as well as the traditional application stack that can be disruptive by these 4 megatrends.
Yeah, I would say, just building on that, where you look at the big trend with cloud computing, with having all the power and ubiquity and analysis capabilities of large repositories of data, and the convergence of that with mobility and mobile devices and having accessibility to that information, and the convergence of these 2 trends by providing a layer of secure access to get to workflows where you can have data integration between various applications, whether they're newer applications in SaaS or whether they're legacy systems. So one of the companies I invest in, PhoneMind, does exactly this, but the opportunities to go and use mobile devices for accessing these large repositories of data and analysis and information from it to enable kind of the rank and file of companies and enterprises, I think, is going to be a very big trend. It's a great time to get into it.
And I could just add and summarize and say, the front end's moving to mobile, the back end's going to cloud. That back end could be outside the firewall or behind the firewall. So I would just summarize this as, mobile-enabled cloud computing. Yeah. And it's a secular journey. Lots of the incumbent public companies, who signs on buildings around Silicon Valley were not built for this era, right? So the infrastructure companies. So there's just a ton of opportunity around that.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I think we have some great advice from these great venture VCs, so enjoy your evening.